Good evening, everyone. My name is Ahmed Hussein. I'm a junior here at Georgetown University in Qatar, majoring in international economics, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's session. As conveners, Georgetown University facilitates these discussions in line with our long-standing speech and expression policy. Here are a few important reminders before we begin. Questions will be welcomed at the designated time. To submit a question, please scan your QR code on the back of the handbooks or notebooks and sign holders, and use the provided format. Secondly, participants are free to use the information shared in these discussions, but out of respect for our speakers and to encourage open and honest dialogue, no attributable comments should be disclosed. Now, to introduce our session, Designing Sudan brings together contemporary Sudanese artists working across multiple media platforms, reflecting the diversity of Sudan's creative landscape. The discussion will highlight how the artistic practices not only respond to trauma and social challenges, but also envision alternative futures and challenge conventional social and political norms. Finally, it is my honor to introduce today's moderator, Larissa-Diana Fuhrmann. She's a researcher and curator at the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt with expertise in political violence, art, and the co-production of knowledge. Her work centers on resistant and decolonial approaches, and she has curated exhibitions, published widely, and advised cultural institutions on politically engaged art and critical curatorial practices. Please join me in welcoming Larissa-Diana Fuhrmann and our distinguished panelists. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Marhaba bikum. I'm very happy to be here with you right now. Thank you so much for attending this panel. I would like to welcome everyone, and I would like to thank the organizers for making this possible and bringing us here together. And I will give a quick introduction into our panelists before then we start. So Rund Al Arabi, who you can see on the fourth seat, is an artist and translator. Her work focuses on the pictorial interpretation of memory. Qutouf Elobeid in the middle is a writer and curator with a special interest in the poetics of the archive. Aala Sharfi, next to me, is a design director. Her work focuses on visual storytelling and branding. They founded Lokale together to design, exhibit, and collaborate with Sudanese creative practitioners. Hadeel Eltayeb, on the very left from me, is a curator, writer, and oral historian focused on identity, cultural production. Her research interests include critical readings in the archives, negotiating narratives of ownership through oral histories, and negotiating the tension between the individual, social, and public remembering through cultural practices. And because all these panelists are actually collaboratively working together, we'll have a bit more of a dynamic conversation style. So we will also react to each other in this conversation. So I would like to start with the first question that maybe all of you can answer that will give us a bit of an insight into the title of this panel. So it's Designing Sudan. And I would like to ask all of you to reflect a bit with us on the idea of what does Designing Sudan mean in your specific practice.
Thank you, Larissa. And thank you to Georgetown for organizing and giving us the chance to have these conversations. It's very rare that we're all in the same room. So as a team that works quite remotely, we're very happy to be here. I'm Aala Sharfi and I'm a designer. So at Lokale, we all wear lots of different hats, but my role has always centered on graphic design, on the visualization of our projects. So through my work, I've come to see design as more than just how things look. It's more about how ideas are structured, how things are sequenced, and ultimately how they are made public. So I think of design as something that is not just decorative or something that's aesthetic, but it's more about creating a system or creating a framework, about creating the conditions that allow Sudanese work to be seen, to be contextualized, and to be critiqued on its own terms. In my practice, I've always kind of seen design as this curatorial method. It's a way of assembling many different pieces into a whole, making something that is then accessible and also feels collective, which is very much what we do at Locale rather than singular. I've also learned that design can operate as a container for many voices. So we tend to respond to content and themes at hand. So rather shaping form around them rather than otherwise. So that's how we decide whether we are doing an exhibition or we're doing a zine or we're doing a publication. And what I also find interesting is how design opens up the process itself. So for us especially, it's created many different opportunities for collaboration. And my teammates, if they'll allow me to say, our work is a lot of the time in the background. So we edit, we curate, we design with others, and even in projects that are not necessarily our own. And in that way, it becomes a tool for participation for us. So to wrap up, for me, design is we're not designing for Sudan. It's rather designing with Sudanese practitioners, with artists, with writers, and thinking about, so when I think about designing Sudan, it's not about creating this final vision. It's more about creating the frameworks that allow work to be expressed and seen in many different ways. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having us, and thank you all for attending and kind of giving an ear to all of the people that have been on these panels today and over the last few days. I mean, I'm not going to take up too much time adding to what Aala said, because we very much work together on the same projects and the same formats, and she covered a lot of it. But I think when we think about design specifically as a curatorial practice, we think about it as designing kind of the parameters for engagement with Sudanese artists and with Sudan as well. This means setting the right conditions for inquiry, making space available for people to enter into dialogue, much like this gathering here. I think this is the kind of work that we do and try to kind of amplify. And I mean, Aala also said this, we don't really work from an outcome. It's about designing a process. So we try to focus on a theme, and we don't work our way backwards from, thinking we want to do an exhibition or we want to do a publication and then find the content to fill that up. Instead, we have a focus, something that we kind of slow burn with, the conversations that we have over very elongated periods of time with other people, bringing new people into the conversation, seeing how the thing that we're tackling itself grows and develops with time and responds to the very much fast-paced nature of Sudanese life and Sudanese reality. And that is kind of the way that we arrive. And I know Aala said it's not just the visual, but I think we owe a lot of kind of the value of our work comes from its aesthetic value, which Aala gives to our work through her design. This is, I think, something that provides for artists validity and builds trust with them to work and want to work with us, because they trust that Aala as a designer on our team allows for their work to be transcribed correctly and for us to collaborate with them in appropriate ways.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for having us here, and thank you for attending and listening, especially at these times. It's actually the first time that the whole team meets since 2019 and that are in one room, so we do not take this lightly. I will cover another aspect of how do we approach design, and it is accessibility. And one point that we think about a lot is having the ability to to get to different audiences and people from different walks of life in Sudan. And it's something that we think about often. And whenever people mention accessibility, there is the notion that, oh, that means that things have to be diluted and have to be simplified for people to access it. But it's actually, for us, it means complicating things and putting them in the right context, and giving it the depth that it needs, and the language that it deserves. And through translating and editing, that gets carried out in order for us, like, arriving to the malleable language that carries all of these complexities and all of these contexts together, through choosing the right language that can express all of these things. Yeah, that's about it.
Assalamu alaikum. Hello, everyone. Thank you to Susie and to Georgetown for the invitation to speak today. It's been wonderful having all these discussions with you, and I'm so excited to contribute and to continue these discussions. I think for my part, thinking about design as a curational process, as an oral historian, I'm thinking about how design animates time. I'm really inspired by John Mbiti, the Kenyan philosopher, and how he talked about how the future didn't exist, and we experience the present through events. It's seasons, ceremonies, conversations that produce time. This aspect of kind of time collapsing, and there are design processes that shape culture, and they're shaped by the social meanings we give it, and they're kind of negotiated. My experience as an institutional and an independent curator in using oral history is trying to think around and control and kind of have a sense of kind of control, I guess, around time. And that's why I use oral history, this aspect of kind of multiple layers of the same memory, an event, a person, a season being represented through multiple meanings. So there's the public record, which would also always be questioned. There's the cultural memory, which has so much to do with our social networks and what we've heard. And then there are our own personal meanings and those kind of unique experiences that we have in representing an experience. So they're all part of kind of how we think about an event. And when I think about kind of how I approach Sudan, it's this kind of these really nuanced meanings. It was really interesting yesterday, I think, in the discussion between Ruba and Ola, they were talking about kind of speaking in diaspora versus from diaspora. And I think Selma also said something about kind of many Sudans and having plural homes. And to me, that's kind of the clearest way of how I interact with Sudan, this idea of representing and invoking kind of multiple Sudans at once, which I think is how I would like to approach oral history, this idea of what can a space be, and kind of creating more of an encounter. So I think that's how the final thought I'd like to kind of leave you with, the idea of oral history introducing a kind of an encounter with time and multiple meanings.
Thank you. I would love to share. I think in 2017, I maybe Instagram messaged you about one of your publications, being interested, and in some cafe place in Buri, I think I picked it up. And I remember opening the envelope and it was just like beautifully designed. I loved the content. I saw so much intention behind it, and but I had no idea who you are. And you just like came up with all these wonderful publications, and you were always like so much in the background. And I would love to hear from you a bit about how you actually founded your collective and what were the gaps you were addressing that you saw at that time in the art scene.
So I can start, and I think my teammates will jump in. Locale was founded in 2016, and I think it's crazy to see that that's almost 10 years ago now. I also want to say that we work very closely alongside Nafisa Tahir, which you will hear from later. And also Safwa Habiballah, who wasn't able to be with us here today. But it was honestly founded throughout many conversations that we had together. We had a lot of unchanneled creative energy, and we also recognized that in the community around us. And we wanted to work, as we've all touched on, with different artists, with researchers, with creative practitioners to explore different themes related to our culture and our socio-political cultures.
I mean, there's something to be said about the unchanneled creativity that we sensed, that it was also unchanneled resistance that we couldn't kind of find a right home for. And it is something obviously born from being born and raised under the Bashir regime and having no framework or frame of reference for the vibrancy of the art scene or art representation in the Sudan that preceded us. And so we didn't know where to go with all of this energy, and what we were doing, I think, as Locale at the time was like this bubbling under the surface of like smaller projects, smaller kind of creating in smaller ways, collaborating in small ways, and almost in a way to quell this soft resistance and energy that we had no place to take, and also a tool to find our own collective voice as creative practitioners. And I think this all came maybe to a peak in 2019 through the revolution, where we really felt we were at the precipice of something, all of us together, manifestation of all of our wildest dreams, and occupation of like public space, and this really extravagant and victorious moment that we felt we were able to then write and create our own history in that moment. And during that time, we held an exhibition in Khartoum titled "This Will Have Been: Archives of the Past, Present, and Future." And through that, we tried to really look at kind of how we arrived in that moment through the archive. And what followed was a series of publications and works around the same themes. And since then, I find our role has become a bit more touch and go, with kind of coming back to us being in the background and us being these creative consultants, essentially, that like try to support other creatives and try to realize their work, and finding our footing now in this very moment with all the, I guess, impossible new realities, and how art fits into that, I think, is still a conversation that we're figuring out amongst ourselves.
I think what has drawn me a lot to your work, and I think what has drawn a lot of people to your work, is the collaborative nature, and that you're creating platforms over and over again, and also the soft resistance that you're practicing. And maybe Rund, now that This Will Have Been has been brought up, maybe you can tell us a bit more about how you work, how do you approach your projects, and can you give us a bit of an insight into your practices?
So the essence of Locale comes into collaboration, which is also something that mirrors many of the things that we do in Sudan in general. And it was infiltrated through the making of so many projects. It's just asking your uncle, asking your mom, like, how can I find this or that? And that's something, that we were doing a lot at that moment. And also, it is something that we were noticing that has been going around, that people were collaborating, but we wanted to find something that exists in print form, where all of these collaborations are documented, and that can be even in a form that travels, which can be either zine, publications, and books. So that was something that we were trying to navigate on how to make it come together in our projects. And I think it's also something that we already finding it, as I said, in Sudan. So we were not trying to bring things into the limelight as much of highlighting what existed already. And one of the zines that we started with is called The Room is the City, which was trying to look into Sudan through the Sudanese homes and going inwards, outwards in a way. And after that, it followed a publication or a zine collection. I don't know how to call it. Yeah, zine print, because it was a combination of different zines put together in a folder, kind of, yeah. It's called Hunak, which looks into the longing of going back home, but also the yearning to leave Sudan at the same time, and how these polar experiences are experienced by Sudanese people in and out of Sudan. But then it brought us into thinking also about the archive later on, and thinking about this will have been archives of the past, present, and future, which is an exhibition that dealt with the material form of the archive and how much of our archive in Sudan exists out of the country, which is baffling to me as I think about it every day. And thinking about ways to address it that is also something that can work for everybody. So it involved an exhibition, it involved a public program that followed panel discussions and also screenings of films that dealt with the archive or dealt with the documentation of what is not around anymore. Yeah.
And Hadeel, you answered an open call that was made by Local, and this is how you started working with them. Can you maybe tell us a bit about how you found it, how then this collaboration looked like?
Yeah, sure. I think what's really important and has been highlighted is that Local were kind of working outside of an institution, kind of creating their own platforms. And I saw the call out for Hanak, and I applied, and they were inspiring to me in terms of what they were already doing. I contributed, I guess, one of the standalone zines Rund was talking about, called Baba's Oral History Transcript, again, thinking around these themes of time travel in a way, like an idea of kind of memories and nostalgia as kind of dislocation. My entry point to a lot of memories of Sudan being kind of entangled. So my idea of Sudan and interpretation of my father's, the barrier between his language and mine, our desire to reach the same idea, our tendency to interrupt each other, just many things kind of explored in the kind of transcript. And it was really great to work with the whole team around kind of even just thinking out what the zine would look like. There was this really nice conversation about using tracing paper that I think came from talking with Aala, and this idea of gaps and kind of leaning into kind of silences and things like that came. So they were really creating something new, and I was really, really impressed by what they were doing. And as Ronald was saying, this idea of archives and kind of what we keep and what we take forward from nostalgia and memories began these kind of other conversations. And I was kind of delighted when they invited me to kind of work with them again for This Will Have Been, for research they were already doing and they'd already started. And I was kind of just contributing my thoughts and kind of curation. And that was a really great experience. So I started working with them in 2018 towards that exhibition.
And coming to looking at the Sudanese institutions at that time, and the artists also individually that were lacking resources and also support from the government, a lot of the projects and spaces were very much self-funded. And additionally, there was also a lot of mistrust, not just by the government towards artists and institutions doing anything in the artistic field, but also from the artistic community for people who got in newly or were coming from outside, from the diaspora, from different circumstances. Could you tell us a bit about your way, like the grassroots work that you did and the opportunities and challenges that came with coming as individuals that created a collective that wasn't institutionalized, but worked in a very kind of institutional way?
I think a lot of the work that we have managed to do is thanks to the creative community, both inside and outside Sudan. I think a lot of the work that we do is not possible without them. And I think looking back to when we first started, one thing to note is that everybody was extremely welcoming. We obviously started working within our own circle of friends and our own networks, but that soon did grow. Everybody was open to collaboration. Everybody was willing to jump in. We were obviously working with very little resource. I mean, we were self-funded, so we had limited resources. No resources. Yeah, exactly. We had a printer at my parents' house, so people were very happy to jump in. Everybody was willing to respond to open calls. The cafe you mentioned in Burri was Caffeine, and that's where we had our first exhibition. And it was honestly all due to how welcoming and how open everybody was. And I think both you and Hadeel touched on this a little bit, is that we were not an institution. We still aren't an institution. We are not registered. We don't have a physical space. We all live in different countries. And we, everything that we did was kind of operating under the radar. And I think sometimes that definitely helped us. And then other times it was a little bit harder.
I mean, yeah, operating outside an institutional ecosystem worked in our favor a lot of the time. But as soon as we came to kind of doing something on the ground and doing the exhibition in Khartoum, we were faced by this tremendous bureaucratic legacy that the Kazan have instilled. And it was one that was about interrogation, about who we were and why we were doing things and where we were getting our money from and all of these things. Where we weren't getting our money. We don't have money. Our being just regular people didn't work in our favor, I think, at that time. And especially when it came to unlocking archives, accessing archives, trying to find a venue to host the exhibition, trying to get permissions and permits, and also thinking about a public program and occupying public space and what kind of unsafety that creates for people coming into the space at the time. There was obviously a lot of police force and us trying to do this thing. People would have questions about, would I be safe if I came to this space, to this gathering? And so I think very much we were saved by the revolution. And I don't think or know that the exhibition would have been possible without the revolution making that kind of access to public space available. And I think in that moment we were really like, okay, this is the turning point where this is where we get to think about new institutions and new ways of working and new ways of building future institutions. And it helped. And now it's a new vernacular, and now it's it's about creating spaces outside of Sudan. And what does it mean to contribute to an ecosystem in Sudan? Does it mean to rebuild? And when do we get to rebuild? And I think there's a lot of kind of questions in the air at the moment. But at the time, it was a very kind of twofold situation.
And so you were looking at the art scene and you were trying to also understand what was lacking and what were the opportunities. Maybe you can talk a bit about what was existing in that field that inspired you, or that you thought was something to expand on, but what was also lacking that you tried to fill a gap with your work.
So again, we started very small. We were self-funded, as we've said, but we had specific grants for specific projects, and the grants were small. But I think because we were quite a small team, we were able to do, if I do say so, quite big things with the money that we had. things that usually would have larger teams behind them. And honestly, that happened by enlisting the help of people that were, willing to help us and willing to contribute. Hadeel flew in to help us set up the exhibition. So I think that's how that kind of thing helped us quite a lot.
I mean, I don't know what was available at the time. I think we also didn't know what was available, and so we didn't know how to enlist it. But what was there was like this tremendous want and need for things to happen, and so people happily offered their time and happily offered their resources, and specifically at the time of the revolution and since, it was. I think this is why I keep coming back to the point of collaboration, because in the absence of an ecosystem, and maybe Hadeel, you can speak to this a bit more because this is your bread and butter, but the only thing that we had to go with at the time was each other, and that did a lot, and it went a long way.
I mean, I think just to say my experience working with Locale with this will have been, I was so impressed by the kind of standards that they held themselves to. Just working within the ecosystem kind of in Sudan at the time, if you think about it, they were working, I mean, institutions, their processes are notoriously slow, regimented, they're very intensive, people and processes going in and out. It's very hard to be kind of experimental. There are aspects where being a kind of a platform that's grassroots were really useful for Locale, but then they also held themselves to kind of presenting a kind of continuity and kind of these kind of spaces for people that an institution would. Like they, there was a public program that was free that invited people into these spaces to screen cinema, like rooftops where people would already gather, and people we could see from other kind of places, that there was something going on and they would join. That was very powerful. The fact that these were kind of, it was a non-temporary space, Beit Turas. It was somewhere that was already established. It had kind of people coming there, but then there was also kind of an invitation for an encounter, like people to kind of come into what was almost like a meanwhile or a temporary space and have like this really, powerful encounter with the idea of archives and questioning kind of, image making and kind of cartography as tools of kind of colonial expansion, and this idea of why are these archives inaccessible, and what do these images mean, and thinking about them together. That was something that wasn't happening, and I really feel like it's important, the fact that they were doing these things at a time when, say, the museums wouldn't be able to offer a bilingual public program, and they were creating these spaces. So I think that's really worth saying. They were working as an institution, but also not as an institution.
And I think what you're pointing out here is that the panels about designing, and I think a lot of people who think of Locale think immediately of designing, but you do so much beyond that. And I can also speak from like the collaborations we did in the past, and just Sudan Retold, the first book, and now the second book. I want to give so much more credit to you for what you're doing in these kind of collaborations, because it's not as if you're getting some content and you're like making it look nice. No, it's so much about like putting it together in a certain way, very attentive, in a very meaningful way. And I think that sometimes gets lost when we think of design. It's not about the aesthetics, but it's so much about the content and how people can then perceive something. And one thing we also wanted to touch on is, you were talking about getting funds earlier and how difficult and how it was actually a gap in Sudan of finding funding. But like, what was the role of like foreign institutions that for a while had kind of a bit of a monopoly as well in like working with cultural actors? So maybe you can tell us a bit about like these kind of collaborations you did with like Mafradat you mentioned, for instance, or other archives that you accessed for This Will Have Been. I mean, you can give us a bit of an insight into this.
Well, I can jump in on this one just to shed light on, in particular, the kind of role of foreign actors. Obviously, it's very, we all know kind of working Sudan, there's an aspect of kind of, you cannot rely on, and you have to rely on kind of foreign actors for some degree of funding. And there's an aspect, I think, when we started speaking to archives, because of the nature of the exhibition and the rationale, a lot of these things were in the West. We had to go to archives to ask if they could, share this imagery that was of Sudanese people, of kind of Sudanese stories, and kind of get them for the exhibition. The ones that I was kind of doing the outreach for, it was interesting. These kind of we went out to kind of Northwestern University in Chicago, the University of Durham and their Sudan archives, the Library of Congress, Washington, D.C. And, we approached them formally. We sent them a rationale about the exhibition. Very quickly, I think they understood how they would be framed. And they did not ask for any payment. And they they readily gave us kind of the images we wanted, which were obviously some of the images were, you can imagine the kind of, colonial images, kind of faceless representation of kind of people. And we were trying to kind of critique that and talk about kind of these images in that way. Unfortunately, there were also kind of other private archives we went to, which is the nature of, I think, the fragmentation of archives about kind of knowledge production in Sudan, where we were asked for payment, and I'm going to name names. So a Noor agency in Paris actually has 12,000 images owned by a kind of variety of kind of Sudanese artists. And it's unclear maybe the nature of the agreements and kind of how they were negotiated, or if they continue to kind of talk to the family members and estates and etc. But images that were already kind of where conversations had been had with kind of photographers, they weren't necessarily they weren't shared with us, but then we were kind of asked to kind of, we were given a kind of a really strong reaction by the kind of director of that organization in terms of kind of critiquing kind of the idea of us sharing their IP. I think it went back to something they were talking about on the first day about kind of who gets to own culture. And there's an aspect of once kind of foreign actors start to kind of claim a certain narrative, then you're kind of negotiating and brokering back your own story or your own image. And we found ourselves in a situation where they were kind of trying to leverage, I guess, having a kind of not ownership, but kind of dominating kind of financially a certain kind of image of Sudan. And this is something that I think is still an issue. And it was very ironic, and with the whole exhibition is about kind of questioning why we don't own our own images, that we had to kind of go through this kind of difficult process. It was resolved in the end, I think, thanks to kind of the diplomacy of and support of kind of Sudanese artists and kind of friends of locale. But it was a really difficult situation that I think it's worth highlighting on this forum.
And since you also work a lot with oral histories and women's voices and how they shape survival and memory, and like this is one of your core works, can you say a bit about how this then became part of the collaboration you did and what that meant to you in the collaboration?
So as well as kind of working on the general exhibition, I worked on a sub-narrative within the Reclaiming the Archive section, which is one of the 3 sections of the exhibition that was really looking at kind of women's visibility in the archive and kind of representation. And a core aspect of that was kind of the maligned authorship of kind of Sudanese women and kind of contributing to culture and kind of having the agency to create it. I was particularly looking at existing kind of cultural practices and things that are kind of weren't kind of seen or deemed of as worthy. Thinking about kind of Agani Banat or Gisa Rus and Zara and all of these different things and thinking around it, as well as kind of representations of women in culture. And we had kind of some of this material did come from those archives I mentioned, which were kind of in the West, but it was also trying to kind of redress that with kind of other imagery. And I think it was really important just to show kind of for me the aspect of social history that kind of people's the way that Sudanese people have been represented. It needs to be kind of rethought, and it can be authored by people who have something to say and should be kind of credited as such as makers of culture. And that was kind of what I was exploring in the essay in After Memory. So it was good also to be able to kind of think through more deeply some of the ideas that we had in the exhibition. And I should say that was an aspect that I very much thought of as kind of collective research, because I was working with and kind of building upon the stories and the interpretations of so many people, which was a really kind of great thing to do, and I did it with I felt a kind of a great honor to be able to do that.
There's several questions that I'm trying to weave in right now. You were talking about like what you also felt was like urgent at the moment that you wanted to work on, like I think for all of you. And a lot of people are asking now about like how this current situation has changed maybe your focus a bit, your practices, what you're looking at, the subjects you're working with. And so the question would be, what solidarities feel very urgent for you right now? Like, what are the subjects you want to work on? Who do you want to work with? Like, who do you address as your audience as well? Maybe you can give a bit of an insight into this.
So outside of just Sudan as well, I've done a lot of kind of research in my practice about kind of solidarity. So solidarity is a type of kind of identity formation, is a type of relations, different ways of thinking about kind of solidarity, and particularly kind of South connections. Since 2024, I started kind of working on a project that was thinking about kind of the Sudan's modern art scene and graphic illustration, and in particular, how solidarity practices move that forward, kind of gestures and articulating kind of solidarity. And that was kind of a big inspiration of kind of how to think of kind of solidarity in terms of kind of finding a purpose and a meaning when things are very difficult, and particularly it can be like how do you kind of, when people are traumatized, how do you kind of have a sense of purpose to move forward? And to me, it hinges upon kind of this aspect of imagination, having kind of the vision to imagine when it's very difficult to see forward. I've also learned in terms of kind of solidarity, people most often have solidarity with people they already have a shared moral stake with, or kind of a shared investment in kind of their culture. So this idea of kind of being able to reach kind of imagination and have empathy for others with different perspectives is kind of really integral to being able to kind of build coalitions and kind of support each other at a really difficult moment. So that's where I'm finding inspiration. And also, when it comes back to this idea of having vision, I just lean on the quote by James Baldwin about kind of things have to be faced. So this idea of just being able to see, and this idea of vision is really key to kind of solidarity.
There's one question here that fits also very well at this point, and the question is, how does Sudanese art specifically design today both preserve cultural memory and act as a form of resistance, and how can it be a bridge between the past and the future within this very critical moment in time? And the question would then, in essence, be, what should designing Sudan mean? I mean, right now, but also in the future. We've talked now a lot about what it meant in the past and in your process, but how would you see this right now and for the future?
Do you want me to start? I think the future's one that, I mean, has become a question for us now. I think, I mean, not to come from a nihilist place or anything, but it is very much something that we feel has collapsed for us a little bit. And so, I mean, we do feel that we've been halted in our work. And I mean, we already were operating with a lot of precarity, and I mean, not just us, but all of the Sudanese artists operate in this precarity, but this has, since the war, been kind of so magnified and intensified. And I think personally for us, we feel some sort of loss of purpose a little bit, because we always came from a place of working towards an end, and the end was always return. And so when we started Local, our kind of ultimate goal was to kind of then set up camp in Sudan. And once that stopped being an option, I think we found ourselves struggling a little bit with where we fit. And we recognize this as obviously a failure and an undoing on our part. But there is, maybe, I think you touched on this just now, Hadeel, but there is something to be said about recall and kind of reimagining. And I think revisiting the past to kind of build our paths forward is maybe something that is the practice to have in moments of rupture like this. And I mean, I said this earlier, but our socio-political moments are so fast-paced in Sudan, and we go through tremendous kind of changes in history in very short periods of time that I don't find we're able to give any one of them the rigor or the research or the pause that they require. And maybe this is that moment. Our hand has been forced to have that moment, and maybe this is, for me personally, I think maybe for Local as well, is a moment to revisit their evolution and give it kind of the pause in the moment and the rigor that it required at the time, because so much came from it that we have now erased and moved past because some massive, more incredible calamity has hit. And yeah, I think maybe it's moments like these where we get to study and reflect to the level that these things call for. And there's a quote by Asata Shakur that I always think of. I think that whenever I'm like faced with these moments, and she says, I think it's a lost ship steered by tired seasick sailors can still be guided home to port. And I think that's something that we kind of just need to all internalize in the way that we think about producing artworks and producing research and studying Sudan moving forward until we find our footing and understand the clearer path with the chaos that's happening.
And concerning the collaborative part, you've worked with Sudan Memory, for instance, just mentioned Sudan Retold as well, and there's Nafisa, who you just mentioned, who you work with. Maybe you can give us a bit of an idea of these kind of collaborations. How do you reach out to people? How do people reach out to you? How are these things made possible? And a lot of people are also interested in how is it even possible to approach you, and how do you find how do you find the ideas for the platforms? How does your process work in this regard?
I think this kind of goes back to how we work quite collaboratively, and I think by working with lots of different creative practitioners and artists and writers and everything throughout the years, it has almost given us a network. As Qutouf has said, we do feel halted, but because of that network, we are able to put our efforts into amplifying the artists that have been able to work. We incredibly admire how people are creating these spaces, how they are creating their own institutions, how they're forming these clusters in a time where everyone feels especially vulnerable. And so we focused more on that sort of background work, which we started doing in the first place. And that's allowed us to collaborate with lots of different people, you, Larissa and Khalid, on Sudan Retold, the team at Sudan Memory, and recently also the Sudanese Kitchen by Umar Tijani. So those kinds of things have allowed us to kind of work in the background and use our efforts to amplify the voices of people that actually can work at this moment, and which is, to be honest, quite amazing. And obviously that takes a lot of resilience, I think, and a lot of strength. I don't know if you guys have.
I can also add the point that the main drive and the way that we work is to make something in Sudan and for Sudan. That has been the point of beginning and end for all of our projects, for all of our meetings, and the thing that we always have aspired to. So the loss of that kind of halted our process to navigate where to go from there. Plus also the loss of the space that used to bring us together. Since we live in different countries and continents, Sudan was always the focal point in which we've met. So I think that also added a layer of disconnect into our process. Yeah.
And we have had quite some conversations in the past about certain similarities of our work, I would say, but also differences. And kind of right now, what is needed from institutions, from networks, in order to make work possible in these circumstances. And each of us, not just from our own experience, but also from the feedback of a lot of the people we collaborate with, we can see and identify a lot of the issues that artists and the artistic community is facing right now. Maybe we can, speak a bit about this and maybe suggestions to make of how things could improve for Sudanese artists inside and outside the country right now.
I mean, I think we can all recognize that institutions, specifically ones obviously outside of Sudan, have categorically failed Sudanese artists. And I think it's in the ways that I think there's so much performance of solidarity over the last few years that has happened because there are wars breaking out all over the world. There are fires that are not being quelled. And I think this is something we talk about a lot. I think even in that performance, we have been failed. They haven't even included us in the kind of the things that gain them currency, right? And so I think we need to hold them to a higher account. I think they need to hold themselves to a higher account when it comes to Sudanese artists specifically. I mean, I don't know of any Sudanese specific artist grants outside of Egypt, possibly. And I think that's shocking. And I mean, I would urge, us to all speak about this internally. And I think maybe for me and Hadeel, because we work inside of arts institutions outside Sudan, I think that we recognize it leaves such a tremendous burden on people who work within these institutions to always be screaming into a void, to be recognized, to be seen, to be supported. And so, I mean, we're happy to do the work, and I think everyone that is inside an institution is going to continue to do that work. But I think the responsibility should sit with them, and they should be kind of jumping at the opportunity to allow Sudanese artists reprieve from precarity and allow them the space to create and speak from their own experience about what is going on, or even not about what's going on. Allow them to create work, because art is the only thing that survives and stands kind of the test of time. So I think there is erasure in the lack of support that is being done, that is not kind of recognized at that surface level. So I think we continue to kind of call them out and call to them. And I mean, this is one platform to do that, but I think we all will continue to do that. And I think it's quite sad that it's having to come always from us, but I mean, it's where we are.
I think particularly for many of us who saw that when things happen in Syria or in Afghanistan or in Ukraine, there were specific grants, as you mentioned, for artists from these countries, and a lot of museums and other like heritage projects were initiated with big funds, and that did not happen really until today for Sudan. And then the few opportunities that are there are very hard for people to access. And I can speak particularly of those artists who are still in Sudan, who international institutions have seemingly big issues with being able to transfer money to people. So it's not just about people not being able to access certain funds, but about them getting the money that, they've been granted. And I think there should be some more flexibility, and there should be ways of experimenting with other forms of transferring money than from a bank account to a bank account, especially when you talk about Sudanese passport holders who cannot open a bank account in many regards. And I would wish for more flexibility from these institutions in finding ways of how to use Bangkok or how to use other possibilities of making Sudanese artists' life more possible and their work. And Qutouf, you also wanted to talk, I think you haven't mentioned that yet, about the responsibilities, like how they can be shared beyond the diaspora cultural workers who carry the burden of creating space and attention for Sudan. And especially, and we know it, a lot of these people are in the room right now. Yusra has also mentioned that the journalism, a lot of that kind of work now lies on the shoulders of Sudanese actors. And while they have enough on their own plate with their own individual story and their families and so on, they additionally have to open doors and fight to create more space and to create more opportunities. How can others get involved? How can their solidarity be built so that it doesn't so lightly lay on the shoulders of Sudanese actors, especially since we said foreign actors have been involved a lot before in Sudan, and then suddenly they all retracted and have not shouldered what they should at this point. Like, how can these solidarities be formed?
I mean, I think that's a question for them. No, like I feel that's again, that is their burden to bear, how to support us and how to be there for us. We've already kind of screamed and made available, even in our history and in the ways that we operate and in the examples that we've given to the world. We are kind of a society that operates on mutual aid. They see the ways that we support each other, and that is just the way that we expect them to show up for us. But I don't know what other ways it can be transferred or shown. And I mean, there are people who have been doing the work and long-standing kind of projects like Sudan Memory, which has now post-war kind of really opened our eyes to, if that had not been done, where would have all of our archives gone, you know? And there are so many ways to support. I know we need money, and I know there is famine, and there are all of these things, and that can feel kind of beyond what we're capable of solving, but solve what you can, right? And solve what you have access to and through your skill sets, and find your community, the people that are working within your field, find how they need support. And I mean, yeah, I think more of these questions need to be addressed to them and what they can do and what they should be doing. I mean, I think we've taught them enough.
I really want to just tack on to Qutouf's point about kind of holding institutions accountable. I was talking before about institutions being, intensive with people, processes, and people and processes. They can also be quite extractive and solipsistic, I guess, when they want to involve and include Sudanese people in the narrative. And I mean, I would always say that, I mean, this is just a general point about kind of art and design. I don't ever see it as kind of aesthetics or as like an add-on in culture. The reason why there's so many funding cuts is because it's presented as kind of something that you don't need. I believe art and design is essential to how we live our lives. It's problem solving. It's essential and urgent to kind of help us get through life. And in a way, kind of, I'm in particular talking about cultural institutions that are kind of catered towards the MENA or kind of serving MENA artists, and kind of how they engage Sudanese artists and creators, and making sure they're including them at this time. I had a really kind of an experience that kind of put me in a lot of conflict that I think I was talking to you guys before about, where before the war in kind of 2023, I was working with kind of an arts festival in London with these two really great Sudanese artists, and kind of working on this proposal for a kind of a theatre programme. And with the development of it, it just became clear that the arts institution didn't want to support them in the way that I thought. Even though in that, Sudanese were very underrepresented as part of the MENA. But then, ultimately it didn't work out, and there were issues with it. And then, 2 years later, after the war, on the one hand, yes, it's good to include Sudanese voices, but it's also good to allow them to speak about things outside of a conflict narrative and themes that they'd like to speak about. And it's just this aspect of kind of how institutions are able to kind of support Sudanese artists without necessarily also serving their agendas. So it's just this aspect of kind of really being the cultural infrastructure supporting Sudanese artists, So it's something that they really need to be held accountable for, and we should continue to put pressure on them.
And so concerning like your work as a platform and as Lokale over years now, putting out publications on a also international, like to an international public, do you feel pressure to kind of represent Sudanese art, is what someone is asking here?
No, because we are Sudanese, and so everything we do is Sudanese art. I think that is the only way that I can kind of tackle that. I mean, we try to deal with our lived realities and the things that we face as Sudanese people and the things that Sudanese people in Sudan face. But we don't try to be representational in any way. And I think that's where a lot of people falter and fail, because I've said this yesterday, but I mean, there's no singular identity. There's no singular way to be Sudanese. I think we try to be true to what we know, and if we are going to be representational, we would never speak on the behalf of anyone. We give them the platform and the voice to do the speaking for themselves and let their own kind of idea or representation of Sudanese art be platformed in that way. What we do is support in the kind of curatorial processes, in the thinking, in the editing, in the kind of transcribing of that process into what can either be a visual language or how it presents to the public. But yeah, I don't think we think of ourselves as representational. I don't know if you guys agree.
Yes. I think one thing that's important is that we never saw ourselves as a platform that wanted to like shine the light on Sudanese art. We always felt that was being done much better by a lot of other people. For us, it was always about how do we create these spaces for dialogue? How do we create these spaces for critique? How do we tie things together in a way that is productive? So I think we obviously do feel pressure. I think that's true. I mean, we do feel pressure to see in which ways we can help, and in which ways we can support those around us. But I don't think we feel that it's our job to, say, come look at this thing or come look at this thing. It's more about creating these spaces for Sudanese artists to grow and to critique and to create these spaces where these conversations can be had, whether that's through exhibition or publication or whatever it may be.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think the reason we don't see that is because we're not really in the business of exporting Sudan or Sudanese art, and we're not really looking at audiences outside of Sudan as our kind of who's consuming what we do. I mean, our main interest is to engage people in Sudan and Sudanese people, and so our conversation is with them, not for them or on their behalf. And I think that's why maybe I don't feel the pressure, but maybe you do.
Someone here has also been asking for recommendations. And maybe besides your own work, like what inspires you in terms of other Sudanese publications, in terms of other Sudanese books? Is there something you can speak on that has been important for you so far?
I'll say Sudan Memory. If you don't know what that is, you should go find out what that is. I think a lot of our work from the very beginning has been about research and about trying to understand and trying to make connections about things. And we always obviously found that quite difficult because we didn't have access to the archives. And I think the work that they're doing is incredible. And I literally get goosebumps about it because I always think like, oh, what would have happened if we, if that work had not been done. So that would be my recommendation.
I mean, for me, they've done a really good job at curating this conference, and there are so many people here that are doing kind of incredible work in their own fields. And I would take this program and everything that's happened in it as an entry point to getting familiar with incredible resources and gateways to things that are being done on and about Sudan.
One example that I'll mention quickly, because this is something I can talk about for a lot, but also I'm someone who's more comfortable in specificities. I cannot, think of a general recommendation, but you should check out the work of the Muse. I think they do an incredible job at making publications, exhibitions, working through different contexts about Sudanese arts and culture that I really admire and follow their work all the time.
Mine would be Sudan Modern Collective, that's led by Suhaib Abikir, who I believe spoke on a panel yesterday. Very much kind of looking at kind of modernisms, African modernisms, kind of architecture narratives. I think it's really great to check that out.
And someone is asking specifically about after memory. Maybe you can say a few words about after memory, and how actually people can access some more of your work, because there's a lot of publications over the years. Is there still access to some of them that reach a few years back, or
Qutouf has the books at her house. So come up to her after the conference and let her ship a book to you. I'll let these guys talk about after memory, but I think again it speaks to the fact that we're not an institution where I know so many people have emailed us for the book, and I'm sorry for not replying to your emails. But we're trying, and I hope you can extend us some grace. But yeah, you can get a copy from Qutouf.
You can get a copy from me. I think I have about 30 copies left, and then if anyone's willing to republish the book for us, this is your platform. But in terms of the older publications as well, again, we're not an institution, we're not a publication house, we didn't have the resources. Our first publication was made by hand. Aala tied all of them by string. We made around 20 copies, 10 of which we reserved to spread it out in institutions in Sudan so that they could be publicly accessible, and the rest, I don't know who got the first kind of I think maybe Larissa, you might have one, but I mean all of our initial publications were housed in spaces in Sudan that no longer exist, but some are also outside of Sudan in galleries and public libraries and things like that. So I think maybe this is a project for us in the future to kind of make them available online, kind of as response to everything that's happened in Sudan and the kind of tremendous loss that we've all faced of our history and our art and things like that. I mean, Rund, maybe do you want to speak about After Memory? Okay. Yes.
After Memory was a book that was coming into fruition alongside the exhibition This Will Have Been. And it was reflecting on the archive in a more animated way, an archive that is in motion, an archive that is not owned by the state. And what does it mean for an archive like that to exist? And also the different ways of documenting and piling something together that one cannot usually think about. For example, there's a great essay by the architect and researcher May Abu Saleh that is called The Deathscapes of Sudan, which talks about graveyards as archives and also the way they were situated in the city through historical times, since Mahdi times, and the formation of the city as it expanded and engulfing all of these different graveyards and shrines in it, and also other archives of corruption, for example, like Abu Bakr's essay about the sports city Al-Madina Al-Riyadiyya, and how in architectural forms some buildings can exist as archives of corruption, which takes us along all of that. But also the process of encountering an archive and what does it mean to find yourself as you go day by day within your own process to be in hold of an archive at a certain moment of time if something switches. So it takes through different sections, 3 sections, which is like goes about encountering, investigating, and questioning the archive. Our main idea back in the day, as I remember, that we wanted to have it to launch the book alongside the exhibition, which is crazy to me when I think about it right now because it's a lot of work. But it was a book that holds as a time mark for us also through what we've been going through at that time in Sudan, because it started revolution, and then it came out during the revolution. Therefore, the writers themselves were going through tremendous changes that also shifted the forms of the texts and the ideas accordingly. It involved a lot of tireless conversations as we navigated this together. So yeah, you can check it out.
And just as a last point before we're closing, there's a lot of appreciation here, not just questions, but for your work from people who've attended your exhibition at Bete Turaf, and a lot of people also like mentioning kind of how your work creates not just a platform for the artists to create work, but also for people to remember, to, you know, like for their memory, for a moment of healing, for like collective identity in a way as well, is what someone mentioned. And I would just like to know, is there a vision that you have for something that you would like to see happen next year, something you would like to do in your like current way of working together, being in that many different geographies and having all full-time jobs, we must say, and doing this all on the side? Like, what is your vision? Because you have done so much already, and what is your next step in this moment where everything seems so fast in motion?
We cannot take this. I think, again, tough question to answer because we're, I think, right now in a moment of just responding to how personally we're responding each to the war and the changing kind of circumstances. I think maybe more of the work happens individually rather than as a collective through local. And maybe you guys can speak to this in your own practices. But I think for me, I'm really trying to get Sudanese artists paid. I'm trying to get funding for Sudanese artists, kind of really pursue this calling out and calling for support for Sudanese artists, and being in a privileged position of having access to art institutions to really kind of advocate for Sudanese artists, but also kind of would really like to create more exhibitions for Sudanese artists, and in that way platform them and kind of give them their own freedom to platform themselves. Do you want to add anything?
Thank you so much. Thanks for giving us an insight and reflecting with us. And thank you so much to the university and everyone who's been involved in putting this together, of giving us this platform. It's been an honor to be on this stage with you. And I'd like to remind everyone that once this session finishes, we'll have a break of 15 minutes. And then the next panel, moderated by Bentley Brown, will start. So thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you, Larissa. Thank you.